sorted out. We also knew that Jesus was coming back somewhere in the 70s or early 80s at the latest. Then we wouldn't have needed all the spare parts and all the other things that we now need to have. So we might not have had all the things straight. After the beginning of the new millennium, a lot of people thought the world was going to end at the year 2000. Of course, I hope nobody here thought that. I didn't. But many did. And so after that, I started looking at some of these prophecies, which I preached years ago. And then I also looked at the book of Revelation, because I was writing for an audience of a few thousand people down in South Africa or Southern Africa, mainly African people, evangelizing among them. And so I started writing a series of articles on the book of Revelation, which I first looked at back in the 1950s, and then started studying it more seriously in 1960, when I got Herbert Armstrong's little booklet, Key to the Book of Revelation, and Revelation Unveiled at Last, and Who is the Beast? Some of you may have gotten some of that literature as well. But then I started looking at the book verse by verse and asking myself, well, is everything I understood correct? And if not, why not? Which forced me to be very careful, because when you write, you have to be very careful that you at least try to write properly. I try to speak properly, but English is my third language, as I often remind myself. I grew up speaking Afrikaans, and then Zulu, and then English. Then I tried to learn Australian, because I was married to an Australian. And then I emigrated to Texas, and now I'm learning another language. Not Spanish, although I'd like to learn that one too. What do we know about the book of Revelation? What can I tell you that will make you, first of all, want to go read the book and not be scared of it? Some people have looked at it and been so terrified by it. The great Protestant reformer, Martin Luther, who lived in Germany, he said it was so terrible it should not be part of the Bible, which was amazing, because he translated it into the German language. In fact, he said it filled me with revulsion. Well, I guess, it's kind of like science fiction, all these beasts and seals and trumpets and plagues and all that kind of stuff. Makes you kind of wonder why it's there. So I looked at this book again, and I learned a few things which I'd like to pass on to you, and I hope it's helpful. The first thing you have to do with the book of Revelation, which really bears no saying, but one should say it, and that is, you should read it for exactly what it says. It's part of the Word of God. Just open it and read it for exactly what it says. And we haven't always done that, and I haven't always done that, because you have other ideas and preconceived ideas before you go there. In Revelation 22 is a very important scripture in the last chapter of the book, which one should read maybe first. In verse 19 of Revelation 22, it says, "And if any man shall take away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part out of the book of life and out of the holy city and from the things which are written in the book." So don't take anything out of the book. Verse 18 said, "For I testify unto everyone that hears the words of this prophecy of the book, if any man shall add unto these things, God shall add unto him the plagues that are written in this book." So don't add anything to this book that's not there, and don't take anything away from the book that's not there. Whatever you do, just read the book for what it says. And when I adopted that attitude, as I started from chapter 1, verse 1, it became kind of interesting. Let's go to Matthew. Revelation 1, verse 1. That's the only place we were going to be today, is in Revelation. So the first thing is, read it for exactly what it says. And then secondarily, read the book of Revelation in the context of the Bible. Now, again, very superfluous statement. It's the last book of the Bible, so surely one should read it in the context of the Bible, not separate from the Bible. It's the last book of the Bible. It's part of the Bible. So read it in the context of the Bible. Here's an interesting thing that I found out, which I hadn't seen before. You know, some of the New Testament books quote the Old Testament as proof for various things. In Bullinger's Companion Bible, I found a very interesting quote. Bullinger wrote, in Matthew, the Hebrew Gospel, why they call it the Hebrew Gospel is apparently it was originally written in Hebrew and then later translated into Greek, because it was written by Matthew, who was a Levite. In Matthew, the Hebrew Gospel, are some 92 quotations from and references to the Old Testament. So the book of Matthew, you'll find 92 references to the Old Testament. That's a lot. In Hebrews, that New Testament book that was written to the Jews, entitled the Hebrews, in Hebrews there are 102 references to the Old Testament, which, if you're familiar or have read some of the book of Hebrews, it's to realize, there's a lot of references to the priesthood and all that type of thing. In Revelation, in the book of Revelation, there are no fewer than 285 references to the Old Testament. Look at that. Matthew, 92. Hebrews, 102. Revelation, 285 references to the Old Testament. There are only 22 chapters in Revelation. 285. You almost do over like 10 per chapter references to the Old Testament. So that tells you that if you're going to read the book of Revelation, first read the Old Testament, because otherwise you wouldn't know what Revelation is talking about. Which kind of explains why you find so much speculation about the book of Revelation, because it's not the known thing nowadays for people to be familiar with the Old Testament. Religious literature tends to quote just little verses here and there, mostly from the New Testament. To go back to people like William Shakespeare or Abraham Lincoln, people who could just quote entire chapters of the Bible, you don't find that anymore today. In the old days, because the Bible was mainly the only book people had around, they read it. And they read chapter after chapter after chapter. And Abe Lincoln, he was known to be able to just sit and quote the Old Testament as well as Shakespeare, as well as other writers. Amazing. So, we must approach the book of Revelation from the basis of the rest of the Bible. And when we come across something in the book of Revelation we cannot explain, what we should do is try to find it in the Bible, in the rest of the Bible. Did any of you ever have any idea that Revelation referred to the Old Testament that many times? It's amazing. Something else that's helpful, in fact, necessary, when you read the book of Revelation, is to have some understanding of history. Now you'll say, oh, that puts me in trouble. There's biblical history, and then there's history, secular history. But you need to have some understanding of history to figure out what's going on. For example, the Apostle John, when he was given this book, was a very old man. Scholars estimate that this book was given to him, this revelation was given to him in about 90 A.D. He must have been close to 100 years old. Very old man. He was a prisoner on the island of Patmos. How do I know that? The book of Revelation says that. If you read through the book, it'll tell you that John was a prisoner on the island of Patmos. Which you should do sometime, just look at a map and try to find Patmos. And you will find it is a little island south of what is today Turkey. Back in those days, Asia Minor. A little island, it was a prison, like an Alcatraz of the day. Or the island off Cape Town in South Africa where they put Mr. Mandela for 25 years. Nothing new under the sun, Solomon said. They use islands as prisons. So John was in this prison on the island of Patmos, very old man. And he would have realized that he was in a similar situation of somebody else in history who lived before. And that was the prophet Daniel. Because if you go back to the book of Daniel, which you're familiar with, I am. I'm named after Daniel. Got my name there. From there. Daniel was a young man when he was taken into captivity into Babylon. And he was there until he was a very old man. He finally died. But Daniel saw Jerusalem destroyed and the temple destroyed. In fact, he was taken away. He would have just heard about it. Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians about 600 years before Christ. So here was Daniel in Babylon, thinking about the city of God that lay desolate, the temple of God that was desolate, destroyed, burnt to the ground by Nebuchadnezzar's armies. And if you were Daniel, what would your thoughts have been? Chances are you would have wondered what would happen to God's people. Your people. So that's what you read about in the book of Daniel, how he prayed to God and said, God, when are you going to intervene for your people? That was the situation Daniel found himself in. That's 600 years before Christ. 70 years later, people went back, rebuilt the temple called the Second Temple under Joshua and Zerubbabel, at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Bible, time of prophets like Haggai and Zechariah. Interesting times. You can put all those people together. And that's the temple to which Jesus came. That's the temple where he walked in there and threw out the money changers and said, "You've defiled my Father's house," which was interesting because Jesus could have been talking about his Father in heaven's house, which undoubtedly he was. But it was also a forefather of Jesus who built that house. Zerubbabel was a forefather of Jesus who built that second temple. So here Jesus was at this temple, and you know the whole story there. He was later crucified, and then in 70 A.D., about 20 years before John received this revelation, Jerusalem was once again destroyed. The city destroyed, the temple burnt to the ground, not one stone left upon the other. Jews killed, scattered, or taken as slaves to Rome, where they built the Colosseum. You've seen pictures of the Colosseum in Rome. Big, round kind of a building. Ruins are still there. Built by Jews, slaves from Jerusalem. The Apostle John would have known all about that. Now, 20 years after Jerusalem was destroyed, he finds himself as a prisoner of the Romans on the island of Patmos. What would John have thought about? See, the context of history makes it kind of live for us. Here's John, an old man. He's a prisoner. What would you have asked if you were in that position? You would have said, what's going to happen? The other disciples were all dead. They'd been martyred. He was the only disciple, the only apostle who wasn't martyred. Paul was long gone, and Peter and all the others. So John would have wondered, what is going to happen? It's logical. What was going to happen to God's people, meaning the church? They were being persecuted and butchered, and blood was flowing, and the Jews were gone. They were in captivity. What was going to happen to God's people when John died? Good question. He needed an answer. That's the historical context of when this book was given. Now you can see here Jesus appears to John in a vision and starts revealing things to him. What was he revealing? He was giving John some answers. What would happen to John? What would happen to the church? What would happen to the Roman Empire? Remember how God revealed to Daniel what would happen to the Babylonian Empire? How Babylon would fall, be replaced by Persia, and then Greece, and then Rome. Now you've got the Roman Empire. What was going to happen to the Roman Empire? That's why you need to know a little bit about history. So if I say Roman Empire, you realize, Roman Empire. Yeah, that started with Julius Caesar, the person who gave us the month July. right? You knew that? Whose adopted son gave us August, because his name was Augustus Caesar. So we have a month called July, and we've got a month called August. And they put those in the calendar so that we now have all these months that are named after gods, you know, Janus, January, February, all these Mars, March, various gods, until you get to Juno, that's another god or goddess, I forget. July, after Julius Caesar. August, after Augustus. Then you have September. The only problem with September means sept, seventh. But it's the 9th month. How did September become the 9th month? Because we had these two emperors who took 2 months for themselves. So September, which was 7th, became the 9th. And October, which obviously means 8th, became the 10th. And November, which means 9th, became 11th. And December, like decimal, which means 10th, became 12th. You with me? Why is all this important? It's not really important, it's just interesting. What I'm telling you is all these historical facts continue living all around us. We live with it, and some people get all bug-eyed about a calendar, you know, oh, this is Christmas Day, or whatever day we get all excited about, and it's just a bunch of numbers on the calendar that the pagans gave us, or some emperor. Okay. But it gives us the context of the Bible. It shows us that everything around us revolves around these things. Not strange. Fascinating, I think. So, John would have wondered, what is going to happen? That's not strange, because we still ask the same question. Don't you? When you see things like Isis, which reminded me of Isis and Osiris, you know, pagan kings way back, or goddesses, or gods, or whatever. Now I see Isis is some group in the Middle East trying to take over the Middle East. You know, you see all these things that didn't exist a few years ago. It's big stuff now. And you have a country called Greece that's seemingly trying to sink into the Mediterranean. You say, what's going on here? And the Germans have to bail them out, and all kinds of stuff's happening all around you. And some real bad stuff, like, you know, some young man who went and shot the whole congregation in the Bible study just this past week. How dreadful that was. Terrible. We should pray for that congregation. But it causes us to say what's going on. You see, that's what John asked. What's happening? What's happening, God? And that's why this book was given. So if we go to Revelation 1, verse 1, that's exactly what it says. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him. So it's not the revelation of St. John the Divine, as the title in our printed Bibles is. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him. God gave it to Christ. To show unto, why was it given? What was the reason for this book? If you believe evangelical Christianity and believe some of the sermons I used to give, you would say the reason why this book was given was to tell us what the end time is like. To tell us when Jesus will come. Whatever other reason you will come up with. No, that's not what the book says. What does the book say? I hope if you learn one thing today, it will be to read the book for what it says and believe what it says. Because to try to take the book of Revelation and tell me when Jesus is going to return, it won't work. Sorry, because nowhere in the book of Revelation does it give us a date when Jesus will come. It gives us events. It gives us things we can look at. But nowhere does it give us a detailed date. And anybody who's ever tried to do that has been mistaken. I know because I used to do that. Tried to. So here's the reason. Revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show his servants things which must shortly come to pass. It's a revelation to John to show John what must shortly come to pass. Was it a revelation about the return of Jesus? Well, Jesus didn't come shortly. He's still not here. Did this revelation include the return of Jesus? Yes. But that's only in chapter 11. Right? Chapter 11, verse 15, where it says, and the seventh trumpet blows, and the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ. Right? And it talks about the 1,000-year period in the Revelation 20. And the great white throne judgment. And then the new heaven and the new earth and eternity. So, here's a book that starts with John and ends where? With the new heaven and the new earth, and that's a long stretch. So yes, this book includes the return of Jesus. We know that. The trumpets, the plagues poured out, and all that. But when it was given to John, it is said here, I'm giving you this book to show you what must shortly come to pass. Now, this is not new to any of you. It just sounds new. Does this book say anything about the Roman Empire, which existed at that time? If you know something about the book of Revelation, you'll say, yes. It tells you that the Roman Empire that was existent then would fall. Right? And that it would be resurrected. And that you'd have several resurrections. Until you have a final resurrection when Jesus comes and destroys it. Right? You're all with me there? Book of Revelation says that, but I can't cover all those subjects in this sermon. For that, I have to go back to the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel 2, Daniel's dream in Daniel 7, then Revelation 13, who is the beasts, mentioned there, Revelation 17, the woman that rides the beast, and you put those 4 chapters together and you have the story all the way from Babylon, all the way until Christ returns. Right? So we know this book covers a long, extended portion of history. What about the church? Is this book only telling us about the end of the church, or where it's going to be at the end? No, it picks up the story right there with John. And it shows John, this is going to happen next, and then next, and then next, and then the next, as you carry on through history. So what I'm saying, or what the book is saying, is this is not only a revelation for the end time. It was a revelation for God's people whenever they lived. So when John died and Polycarp took over as Bishop of Smyrna, which history will tell you, Polycarp was a disciple of John and he was the Bishop of Smyrna. And Polycarp thought, what is going to happen now? He knew, because God had shown in this book, that the church would continue and you would have a church in Smyrna. And when Polycarp died and Polycrates took over, the story continued. So in chapter 2 and chapter 3, you have a prophecy of these 7 churches on this Roman postal route that started at Ephesus and went all the way to Laodicea. And it's a mistake just to read one of those churches and say, are we Laodiceans or are we Philadelphians? Because that's not what God said we should do. What did God say we should do? If you go to chapter 2 and chapter 3, it says, he that has an ear. If you put your hand on the side of your head and you feel something there, this is an ear. I know I have an ear. I have 2. If you have an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. All 7 of them. Read all the messages. That's a different sermon, but that's a good Bible study for you, because you may have lost your first love like Ephesus did. You may be suffering persecution, face death like Smyrna did. You may be practicing Christianity where Satan's seat is, right in a bad place, like Pergamos did. One couple we visited down at Port Elizabeth in South Africa, the man said to us, I don't believe there's a devil. And his wife looked at him and said, who do you think I've been living with all these years? She was trying to practice Christianity right where Satan's seat was. I guess that's how she felt. Very quickly now, you can see that the book of Revelation is not just an end-time book. It was a book given to God's people. It was given to John so John would know what would come after him. Then his followers could read this book and see what was happening then. If you lived at the time of, say you lived 1000 A.D., what was happening 1000 A.D.? If you try to find people, true believers, you would have had to search for them because they were scattered. They were being persecuted. What you would have found, there was a big church in Rome that sent out the crusades. You heard about the crusades? Those were wars under the cross. And you would have sat there and you would have seen this big church in Rome sending out these vast armies, sometimes with the Pope at the front of the army. And you would have wondered, what's going on? And you could have turned to this book, and this book would have told you exactly what was going on. That was false. That they were making war. And that's not what God said we should do. If you lived at the time of the invention of the printing press, when Gutenberg, a German, invented the printing press, You may have been a bit excited because the very first book ever printed on the printing press was the Bible. And chances are, if you were a believer at that time, you would have thought, this is good. Now I can have my own Bible. I don't have to struggle like Peter Waldo did, who started translating the Bible into French. Now I can have a Bible in German or in whatever language. Or when John Wycliffe translated the first English Bible from the Latin Bible. He was not a Greek or Hebrew scholar, so he translated from the Latin. John Wycliffe was a Lollard. Who's ever heard of the Lollards? It's one of those little groups that you find in history. The Albigensians, the Waldensians, and the Lollards. Among them you would find believers like you and me. John Wycliffe was a Lollard. He was the first English translator of the Bible. Later, William Tyndale translated the New Testament. Then you had the Geneva Bible. Then you had the King James English Bible. I gave a sermon in Big Sandy asking the question, what Bible did the Pilgrim Fathers bring to America? You ever thought about that? This is the King James Bible, 1611. That tells you that this was not the Bible that the Pilgrim Fathers brought to the New World, because they got here originally, the first ones got here in 1607. Right? Or you just say, oh, well, that's if you say so, okay. American history, 1607. The first settlement where? In Virginia, Jamestown. So obviously it wasn't the 1611 Bible that they had, because it hadn't been published yet. So what was the Bible that they brought over here? Pilgrim Fathers up in Massachusetts. The Geneva Bible, yes. How many of you knew that? That's a new bit of history, isn't it? Yeah, the Geneva Bible. Interesting. So this book was given to show God's people what must shortly come to pass. And that's still the reason why we have the book. It didn't matter where you were in history, you could read this book and figure out what's going on. And sometimes you're confused. Then you have to just keep reading or wait. Or wait. How many of you knew Herbert Armstrong? A few of you. My wife and I were married by him. We knew him very well. He started preaching in the 1930s, and then the world became very chaotic. There was the big depression, of course, from the 1920s. And 1930s was the time of the Dust Bowl in the United States and South Africa and Australia. All those countries were all affected the same way. President Hoover was president of the United States during the Depression. He was followed by FDR, right? Franklin Roosevelt. What was happening in Europe? There was a big dictator in Italy who had himself coronated as King of Italy. Mussolini was his name. Il Duce. Herbert Armstrong saw this man and he thought, this may be the end-time dictator. It's going to cause a lot of trouble in the world. And then when the Ethiopians kicked the Italians out of Italian Somaliland up in North Africa. And Mussolini retaliated. It sure looked like this was the king of the South going up against the king of the North, and the king of the North retaliating. And many people at that time, preachers, thought this is going to lead to the end of the world, including Herbert Armstrong. He said this is dangerous. Except that Herbert Armstrong had his nose in the book of Revelation, and he was looking at the various resurrections of the Roman Empire, and he realized that there had been several resurrections, starting with Justinian, 554, Charlemagne, 800 AD, Otto the Great, Charles the Great, Napoleon, 5, Hitler, who then superseded Mussolini, was 6. So right in the middle of all that conflagration, Herbert Armstrong realized, no, wait a bit, there has to be another one. So while Hitler was still supreme, Herbert Armstrong was preaching that this is not the end. Why? Because he just happened to look in the book of Revelation. It's good to keep looking in the book of Revelation. In 1964, I was in Romania. I was traveling there, and I was living for a few days in a little town called Vașcău in Romania. And I learned to communicate in Romanian. I think I have a gift for languages. And when I came back from Romania, I gave a speech in speech class in England. And I said, Romania and Hungary will join the common market. Why did I say that? Well, because I'd just been with those people, and I could see they were Europeans. They were not communist Russians. They were Europeans. Their history was tied to Europe, and sooner or later, they would join. My speech instructor at Ambassador told me, I wish you wouldn't come here and talk such nonsense. Anyway, because now they're part of the European Union. It was just logical. I looked at it and I knew what the Revelation said. And, you know, so you could look at things. And then in 1967, I was standing in Berlin, at the wall in Berlin. Here was the big wall. In fact, walked through the wall into East Berlin, went to the museums there, went through Checkpoint Charlie, as it's called. And I looked at that wall, and I knew sooner or later that wall would have to come down. Why did I know that? Because the events of Revelation would unfold. It's just a matter of when. Right? I didn't have dates. I didn't need dates. I just saw events. Which is the interesting thing with the book of Revelation. It said in verse 2 of chapter 1, Revelation 1 verse 2, John, who bore record of 3 things: the Word of God, which we find in the Old Testament, the testimony of Jesus Christ, which we find in the New Testament, and all the things he saw. Which makes it fascinating because John saw things and then he wrote them down. Why? So that somewhere in history, when we look and we see things, we can realize, oh, this is what John saw. You don't have to speculate. You don't have to guess. For example, in Revelation 11, which is easy to remember, 11, see this? 11. That's where you find the two witnesses. Right? Okay. You can't forget that. Revelation 11, two witnesses. Who are the two witnesses? I have no idea. Do I need to know now? No, because they're not there. Now, sometime in the future, when you find two people standing in Jerusalem who have the power to shut the heavens for 3.5 years so it doesn't rain, and they have the power to bring fire down from heaven, it'd be a pretty good guess that they are the two witnesses. Right? Because that's what John saw. And until you see that, you don't have to worry about it. We're not there yet. It's as simple as that. You read it for what it says, and if you don't see it, it's not there yet. Is the New Jerusalem here yet? Of course not. Will it be here one day? Yes, because John said, I saw the city, and described it. And guess what? When you see the city, and it looks like that, you'll know that's the New Jerusalem, right? It's the same thing throughout the book. It's a fascinating book. This is the most encouraging book that any Christian can read. Surprisingly. Because you can just read it for what it says and say, okay, let me apply that to me. When I read about the 7 churches, don't worry about who's who. Find out, who am I? Am I like the Thyatira church that did more in the end than they did in the beginning? See, it's a good attribute. How do you know whether you're a Philadelphian Christian? If you have brotherly love. Right? You can tell whether somebody's a Philadelphia Christian because Philadelphia means brotherly love. We all know that. You know, our church founders spent time in Philadelphia, didn't they? Isn't that where Jefferson wrote the Constitution? Right? Philadelphia. City of brotherly love. Which they forgot after that, and they started fighting each other in the Civil War and all that. Can you see how fascinating this is? It helps you to answer questions when things come up. Some of you, like my wife and I, back in the 60s and 70s, when the common market still consisted of 6 nations. Remember that? 6 nations in the common market. It had started back in 1957 with the European Steel and Coal Union. It joined France with Germany so they wouldn't fight each other. They would share steel and coal. One lot have coal and others have steel, so they joined it together in the Treaty of Rome, 1957. Then it became the European Common Market, ECC. And there were 6 nations. And we looked at them and we thought, now if there are 10 nations, that'll be the sign of the end. Right? Some of us thought that. And I looked at them as much as anybody else, having spent time in Europe, spent time in Germany. Well, time went on, and before we knew where we were, there were 27 nations in what is now called the European Union. 27 nations. One morning I woke up and I asked myself the question, Where were we wrong? 27 nations. What's going on here? And as soon as I asked the question, I had the answer. That's the good thing if you have this book in your head, which I do. We were traveling from Big Sandy going back to Dallas, and the car had broken down on the side of the road, so we stopped to help this man who we saw was in trouble. He turned out to be some preacher chap from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So we helped him, and he immediately started preaching to me and asking me whether I knew who the beast was and do I know something about the book of Revelation. I thought, of all the people, we should have met that day. But we did help him. And I said to him, well, actually, he started quoting Daniel and Revelation. I said, there are 2 books in the Bible I know every word of. He said, really? I said, yeah, they're Daniel and Revelation. He said, really? I said, yeah, I know every word of both those books. And I'm not boasting, I'm just saying it as a fact. If you've read them about 500 times or whatever times I've done. Anyway, that ended his preaching to us, and we just fixed the car, or let him fix the car. But I asked myself, where were we wrong? And as soon as I said that, I knew the answer. If we go to Revelation 17, have any of you thought about that? You got 27 nations in Europe, and, what's this 10 nations, groups of nations? And you'll still find articles put out by the churches of God, and they'll say 10 nations and groups of nations. What's wrong with that statement? In Revelation 17, where you find the woman who rides the beast, verse 12. The 10 horns which you saw, Revelation 17, verse 12. The 10 horns which you saw are, what does it say? 10 kings. It doesn't say nations or groups of nations. We said that. You see, that's what happens when you put other words there that are not there. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings which have received no kingdom as yet, but will receive power as kings for 1 hour with the beast. So I don't have to look at nations anymore. I don't have to look at groups of nations. I don't have to guess which nations will be in there and which won't. I don't have to worry about that. I'll just have to wait if I'm still alive on earth, or my grandchildren who will be still alive on earth. When the time comes, they will see 10 kings. Now, a lot of kings in Europe that don't have any power right now. Do you know that there are 10 royal families in Europe? Yes. One newspaper reporter called them the greatest group of unemployed aristocrats in the world. Now, the royals in Europe all know who they are. They get together anytime there's a wedding or there's a birth of a prince who's going to be, or princess who's going to be christened or baptized or whatever they call it. All the royals gather. We don't know about it because we're not royalty. But there are royal families. They're still there. The remains of the Romanov family were found a few years ago. The Romanov family was the royal family of Russia. They were killed by the communists back in 1917, I believe. The Romanov whole family was murdered. And somebody found their remains, or thought they were the remains of the Romanov family. So somebody went there and they got DNA samples to see if they could identify, are these really the Romanov people? They got the DNA, and guess who they compared the DNA with? Prominent royals. They compared the DNA of those remains with the DNA of Prince Philip, who is the husband of Queen Elizabeth of England. Because, you see, Prince Philip is a descendant of both the royal families of Denmark and of Greece. And when they compared his DNA with the DNA of this family that they found, it was a match. That's family. So the new Russia took the remains of the Romanovs and they reburied them, or reinterred them, as they say, and put a monument on it. See, they're all linked. They're all joined together. Who knows Brooke Shields? You know who Brooke Shields is? Tell somebody, about when they know who Brooke Shields is. What was the movie? Blue Lagoon. You didn't see Blue Lagoon, did you? You sinners. Her first movie, I believe it was. Brooke Shields went on this ancestry program that they have on TV, where celebrities go there and they find out who they are. And she could never understand that she had an affinity to the French people. So she went there in this ancestry thing. And these people came and sorted out her ancestry and found out that Brooke Shields was a direct descendant of Henry I, a king of France, from whom came that whole series of kings that ended up with Louis XVI. Little American girl who finds out that she's royal descent. Isn't that amazing? There's hope for all of you. It's a fascinating world, and this is a fascinating Bible. I wrote to one of our churches of God, to a friend of mine over there, and I said, hey, we've been wrong. We shouldn't talk about nations and groups of nations, because that's not what the Bible says. The Bible says kings. He didn't reply to me, but he got somebody else to reply to me. So the other person wrote to me, and he wrote to me and he said, I don't care what you say, but our church doctrine is that there will be nations and groups of nations. I thought, really? Later on, the man I originally wrote to came down to Dallas, and he was speaking to the congregation there, and he said, going through this prophecy, and he said, I believe that it will be 10 kings. I thought I should go and remind him that I was the one that wrote to him and said, hey, it's the 10 kings. Where did I get it from? Because that's what the book says, 10 kings. Don't worry about it. When they come, when they're there, we'll see them. Those who are still alive, we'll see them. The rest of us will come back with Christ and hear what happened. That's how simple this book is. You don't have to speculate. You don't have to worry. You don't have to get, what's happening? What's all these Muslim radicals? Where are they in the Bible? They're not in the book of Revelation. Don't you think that God would have identified the Ishmaelites? He could have put their name right there in the, a book that refers to the Old Testament 285 times. You think it would not have mentioned Ishmael if that's what God wanted us to know? No, these things that are happening in the Middle East, they're just happening in the Middle East. They're just part of all the chaos. Like years ago, it was all in Africa, 1,000,000 Tutsis. When 1,000,000 Tutsis died, remember that? 1,000,000 Tutsis died. Did you go to the book of Revelation and try to find the Tutsis? No. But you know, when it gets close to Jerusalem, then we will find out, where are they? Oh, somebody told me. No, I won't tell you what they were speculating. It's not there. What's beautiful about this book is you can always just come back and read it. The first message in the book is to the churches, to you. Read chapter 2 and chapter 3. That tells you about the churches. Read chapter 4, shows God on his throne. Chapter 5 shows Jesus, the one who was willing to die for us, who comes there, and he takes this sealed book. Very interesting difference between Daniel and Revelation. I'll close with this. Let's go back to the book of Daniel, Daniel 12. I'll end with this one principle, a very interesting principle. The book of Daniel, there were things that Daniel could not understand. No surprise, there are still things in the book of Daniel that I still don't understand. And undoubtedly, there may be something there that you don't understand. In Daniel 12 and verse 9, verse 8 it says, I heard, but I understood not. Then I said, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? Daniel didn't understand. Verse 9, and he said, Go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Daniel, some things there were sealed, not to be understood until the time of the end, which is why we still don't understand some of them. No such statement is found in the book of Revelation. In Revelation 6, you find a scroll sealed with 7 seals. You actually find in chapter 5 a scroll sealed with 7 seals. But what happens to those seals? They are opened. The book of Revelation is not a sealed book. It is a book called Revelation. What does the word revelation mean? Opening, revealing. Just to have fun, God chose Greek to be the language it was preserved in. Because the word for revelation is apocalypse. What does apocalypse mean? It means revelation. I know in the movies it means apocalypse. All fall down. No, the word apocalypse just means revelation. It's the book of Revelation. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are the 4 horsemen of Revelation. Simple. I hope this helps you. Maybe encourages you to go back and read it again. Just read it as if God suddenly gave you a revelation of what is soon going to happen. And chances are you'll see what's happened in the church, what's happened in your life, what's happening in the world around you. And as it says, in patience, possess your souls. You don't have to worry. Just keep going. Because it doesn't matter what happens out there. It's bad, it's sad, yes. But as long as you follow God, you serve God, these things will pass. And ultimately, it doesn't matter where in history you look at it. As I say, the time will come when Jesus will return. And you look up and you say, ah, this is what John saw. Then you'll see Satan taken and tied up, and you'll say, oh, this is what John saw. And then you'll have 1,000 years rule with Christ and the saints, and you'll say, oh, this is what John saw. And then you'll see the heaven open.